provincial Scottish society. Effectively, that's what we are. I respect Dr. Newton's opinion, and I respect Lewis's opinion. However, I disagree. Culture, as we know, is not solid, it's not unified. It's actually quite fluid. And indeed, for the last 100 years, all of North American society, and indeed all of Western society, has gone through cultural creation and cultural recreation. The elements that you see here this evening that represent what we consider the Scottish world, the kilts, the tartans, the music, the Highland dancing, the bagpipes, those are all part of our cultural identifiers. Those are symbols that have been created to represent us, we the Scots, as a people. The Gaels are 1/5 of those people. They are still part of the greater Highland culture. They're still part of the greater Scottish nation. I'm not saying that they shouldn't follow their own way and actually learn their own language and relearn their own language and have their own traditions. However, they fit into a much larger Scottish cultural world. Indeed, the diaspora from Scotland that existed between 1746 and 1850 took about 3 million Scots around the world who started to produce like rabbits. They bred a lot. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that Scotland, as we know it, was not a very pleasant country in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. It just wasn't. That's why your ancestors are here, and that's why my ancestors are here. Because Scotland, as much as we loved it, and it's a cultural memory we all have, it was a really crappy place to live. The English are always at us. I mean, most of the time, and then we don't even talk. And one of the things, and of course, it's odd that I never hear this mentioned, as someone who was from a Scottish community from Halifax, I know exactly what goes on between Antigonish and Pictou. No one ever talks about the religious, the ideological differences that have made Scotland one of the worst places to live, because the clans fought amongst themselves, then the communities fought amongst themselves, the counties fought amongst themselves. Indeed, no wonder we were always primed and ready for the taking over. It's our own fault. What do? We ally with France. Who's France? The enemy of our neighbor. Why would we do such a thing? This is insane. This is the Scottish identity. This is what we do to ourselves. So, I want you to understand this. I don't speak Gaelic. I speak French. I'm also part Acadian. All right? I speak English. I was raised at Wallace. William Wallace, as we all know, as the great hero. I have really no connection to that. I mean, that was 700 years ago in the past. But it's part of our cultural history that we need to know and identify. Let's fast forward, and I appreciate the Marxist view that you have on Anglo-domination. Okay, I'm a realist. What I'm trying to just convey here, and I'll talk about cultural recreation, etc. What I'm really trying to say is, and really the question itself is skewed, and I appreciate what Mr. Gillis has said. I mean, it's like, how do we recreate authentic Highland culture? Really, there is no answer. Because authentic Highland culture, when do we decide that authenticity starts? When do we decide that it ends? I mean, yes, I can tell you all about tartans, and indeed I will. Tartans, as we know it, started exactly in 1822. Wilson's Bannockburn, in the honor of the, I guess, the state progress of George IV going to Scotland and becoming Scottish. But remember, I mean, tartans had been interdicted, which is prohibited, for about 35 years. They went on a tartan orgy. The first tartan, as we know it, that was named, was actually the Rob Roy. You may know it as the black and red checks. The second one, I happen to be wearing. Because, of course, William Wallace was a great hero of Scotland. So what do? They put yellow lines through it and black lines through it, Rob Roy. At which point, the Campbells produced a giant portrait of their ancient chief who's wearing actually some sort of pattern. What does Wilson's of Bannockburn do? They reproduce it. Then they make Victoria tartan, Prince Albert tartan. Everyone's got a tartan. And then the large families all over Scotland, many of whom are Highland, all want their own tartans. It becomes de jure. It's proof of your identity as a Scot. Okay, and this is where it gets weird. At the time, they started referring to themselves as North Britons. South Britons are the English. The West Britons are the Welsh. What are the North Britons? The Scots. So the Scots start to identify, and they start to create this mass culture, of which the Gaels are also part, although linguistically and culturally distinct. In a North American context, Scots come in from Scotland, and they're here with ethnic groups from other places. Typically, the English have taken over. This is an English system, and we'll talk about a little bit of this later. How much time do I got? Because I can go on forever.
Well, you have about 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay. So the Scots, they come into these communities, and as Scots, from all the different areas of Scotland, from all the different cultures of Scotland, they start to cooperate with one another. Now, it's not to say they don't set up pockets. Antigonish is one of those pockets. But there are communities like Antigonish all up and down this eastern seaboard. Now, unfortunately, they've been assimilated. So the Highland Society, as we know it, is effectively a mutual benefit society that's set up to protect and promote each other's interests. In some areas, the North British Society in Halifax becomes an insurance company. The North British Society still has a lot of money because initially it was an insurance company. But what they did is on certain days, they would actually remember the old country from which they came and their traditions. Some of the traditions were positive and some of the traditions were negative. But it's not to say that these traditions are invalid. These traditions are very valid, especially as we progress through the 19th century and into the 20th century. By the end of the 1800s, what we know is a kilt, which was based on the great Filet, the great kilt, the great national kilt. That's been solidified into what we know as a kilt. The front has 2 aprons, the back has pleats. You have Highland regiments. You have Highland regiments who have pipe bands. Pipe band music has been quantified and solidified. The Highland dancing, as we know, yes, it's all based on Victorian norms, but that was the Victorian interpretation of the world at the time. Now, of course, there are rules and regulations. So as we morph into the latter half of the 20th century and all through the 20th century, really what happens is, well, my grandparents had done it, so it must be valid. It is part of our culture. And this is why I'm talking about culture recreation. And I really appreciate, I guess the problem that I have as being one who values all aspects of culture, the return to Gaelic roots confuses me in that it's almost xenophobic. It's almost, and I understand the fear of assimilation, having come, as I mentioned, part of me is Acadian. Les Acadiens parlent presque pas le français ici en Nouvelle-Écosse. They just don't. The Acadian language is actually in danger. It has protection rights according to the federal government. Whether or not it survives the polyglot of Anglo culture, well, unfortunately I don't have those answers. My family, at least my grandmother's side of the family, stopped speaking English, or stopped speaking French back in the 1950s. It just stopped, because it wasn't worth it. So, this is why I sympathize. I sympathize with what you're saying. But where I'm coming from is that tartans and bagpipes and Highland Games are symbols of who we are. And they're the only method that we have for cultural advancement and transmission to the next generation. And really, a society that looks backwards in time and thinks about the good old days or the golden age is a society in trouble. And there are people in this room who know me from different Scottish events, and they know how passionate I am about Scottish culture. I don't look backwards to the past. The fact that we wear these things, it doesn't mean that I'm stuck in 1860. It doesn't mean I'm stuck in 1746, wishing that Bonnie Prince Charlie would come and save us all. What it does is represents the fact that I am Scottish. And it represents that to the rest of the world. And by the way, the Scots in Nova Scotia are really special because we actually represent 31% of the population. Did you know that? You need to write to your MLA. 1 minute? All right. You need to write to your MLA. The fact is that we are the largest ethnic group. I'm not saying cultural group, I'm saying ethnic group. We are the largest ethnic group in the province. And it's about time we started to act like it and started to cooperate. So, guess what I'm saying is the value, or the high value for the Highland Society? Well, you just got to keep doing what you're doing. So, yeah. I don't want to seem anticlimactic, but really that's it. It's an impassioned plea.